The dog's frantic barking echoed through the empty church, sharp and unrelenting. She stood rigid before the towering crucifix, eyes locked onto it as if something unseen held her in place. No matter how many times she was called, she wouldn't look away. Her claws scraped against the stone floor, her body trembling, yet she remained rooted. The candlelight flickered. A draught whispered through the halls. Still, she barked desperate, insistent. Something was there, something only she could see. The wind howled through the trees outside St. Bartholomew's Church, rattling the stained glass windows and seeping through the cracks of the ancient stone walls. A cold draught whispered through the dimly lit sanctuary, rustling the pages of an open Bible on the pulpit. The church, normally a place of serenity, stood in eerie silence until the barking began. It started as a sharp, frantic yelp, then grew into a series of panicked barks that echoed through the stone corridors. Father Thomas sat up abruptly in his small quarters at the back of the church, his heart pounding in the sudden stillness that followed. Then another bark, louder this time, desperate, almost pleading. Frowning, he swung his feet onto the cold wooden floor and grabbed his robe. The church was supposed to be empty. He had locked the doors himself hours ago, after evening prayers. Who or what could be making that sound? With a lantern in hand, he stepped out into the corridor, his breath visible in the chilly air. The barking continued, rapid and unrelenting, coming from the direction of the north transept. He quickened his pace, his slippered feet making soft echoes against the stone floor. As he reached the archway leading into the transept, he hesitated. A flickering candle near the altar cast long shadows against the walls, making the church's age-old architecture seem alive. The crucifix, the church's most treasured relic, hung high above the transept, carved from olive wood, said to be brought from the Holy Land centuries ago. And at the foot of it stood a dog. A golden retriever, her fur damp and matted, her body trembling with both fear and determination. She stood rigid, tail low but not tucked, muscles taut beneath her rough coat. She barked in rapid bursts, her eyes locked onto the crucifix above. Father Thomas furrowed his brow. How had a dog gotten in, and why was she so fixated on the crucifix?
Easy now. Shh, it's all right,
he murmured, stepping closer. The dog didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge his voice. Her gaze remained locked on the cross. Her barking hadn't subsided, if anything. It had become more insistent, as though she were trying to alert him to something unseen. Father Thomas took another step, then another, until he was standing right beside her. He followed her gaze up to the crucifix. Nothing. Just the same carved figure of Christ, his head bowed in eternal suffering, the wood aged and darkened from centuries of devotion. The candlelight cast shifting shadows across its surface, but there was nothing unusual about it. Still, the dog would not stop barking. Father Thomas knelt beside her, hesitating before reaching out a hand. The ancient crucifix loomed above them, silent and unmoving, yet the dog remained fixated on it, her entire body rigid with tension. Her barking, sharp and insistent, echoed through the empty church, each sound reverberating against the high stone walls. His fingers brushed against her damp fur, and for the first time she seemed to acknowledge his presence. The barking wavered, turning into a low, uncertain whimper. He ran his hand gently along her back, feeling the outline of her ribs beneath the thin layer of fur. She was frail, underfed, clearly a stray that had been fending for herself for too long. She shivered, but did not pull away. Slowly, the rigid line of her body softened, the intensity in her gaze diminishing as her breathing steadied. A moment later, she finally tore her eyes from the crucifix, pressing into his touch as if grounding herself in the warmth of another living presence. Father Thomas exhaled, only now realizing how tight his chest had felt. The barking had set him on edge, but now, in the silence that followed, something else lingered, a feeling he couldn't quite name. He glanced back up at the crucifix, studying it carefully. The wood gleamed in the flickering candlelight, smooth and solid, undisturbed. There was no reason for the dog's reaction, and yet A draught swept through the transept, making the candlelight waver. The dog let out a low whine, shifting closer to him. Father Thomas sighed. He couldn't leave her here. Whether she had wandered in from the storm or been drawn here by something unknown, she was frightened, cold, and alone. Whatever had caused her panic, he doubted she would find comfort on her own.
Come on, let's get you warm,
he said, standing up. He patted his thigh, encouraging her to follow. She hesitated, casting one last glance up at the crucifix before finally stepping forward. As he led her back through the darkened church, he couldn't shake the nagging unease that had settled in his chest. St. Bartholomew's Church had stood for centuries, weathering storms, wars, and time itself. It was not a place of fear. But that night, as Father Thomas returned to his quarters with the dog curled up at his feet, he couldn't help but wonder why had she reacted that way, and more importantly, what had she seen? The morning light filtered softly through the stained glass windows of St. Bartholomew's Church, casting warm hues of red, blue, and gold onto the cold stone floor. The night's storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp stillness, but Father Thomas couldn't shake the memory of the dog's frantic barking. He had barely slept, his thoughts lingering on the unsettling way she had fixated on the crucifix. With a weary sigh, he rubbed his eyes and reached for his robe. He had resolved to check the church at first light, half expecting the dog to be gone, returned to whatever forgotten corner of the world she had come from. But as soon as he stepped into the vestibule, he saw her. Curled up on the stone floor just beside the heavy wooden doors, the golden retriever lay sleeping, her fur still slightly damp from the night before. Her body was curled tightly, her ribs faintly visible beneath the golden waves of her coat. She shifted slightly at the sound of his footsteps, letting out a soft sigh but not yet waking. Father Thomas knelt beside her, studying the way she curled into herself, small despite her breed, worn thin by hunger and exposure. The previous night's disturbance still lingered in his thoughts, the echo of her frantic barking refusing to fade. But in this moment, that concern was overshadowed by something more immediate, more tangibly a creature in need. She stirred slightly, her body tense but no longer trembling. After a moment, her warm brown eyes opened, meeting his with quiet trust. Slowly, she lifted her head, as if acknowledging his presence in a way she hadn't before. Without hesitation, he rose to his feet, silently making his decision. There was no question now. She would not be left to fend for herself. Turning toward the rectory, he gestured for her to follow. As he walked, he could hear the soft sound of her paws against the stone floor, trailing just behind him. He fetched some bread from the kitchen, along with a small bowl of milk. It wasn't much, but she lapped at the milk eagerly and nibbled at the bread with delicate bites. As he watched her eat, he knew he couldn't turn her away. A church, after all, was meant to be a refuge. By midday, she was following him as he moved through the church, a silent companion to his daily routine. When he swept the stone floors, she trailed behind him, her paws making soft, rhythmic sounds against the worn surface. When he tended to the candles, ensuring their steady glow, she sat patiently nearby, her tail thumping gently against the ground in quiet contentment. When he settled at his desk, flipping through old scriptures and running his fingers over the fragile pages, she curled up beneath his chair as if she had always belonged there. As he worked, he found himself pausing now and then to glance at her, considering the quiet presence she had so easily made a part of his world. There was something fitting about the way she had come to him, unexpected yet certain, as though she had been placed in his path with quiet intention. He watched as she dozed at his feet, her breathing steady, her body finally at rest after what had likely been a long struggle for survival. A name came to Mindone that carried both mercy and mystery, a reflection of the quiet, often unexplainable ways in which the world moved. Grace. As if sensing the thought, she lifted her head slightly at the sound of his shifting posture, then let out a slow, contented sigh and rested it back down. It wasn't long before the congregation took notice of Grace. At first, there was some hesitation. An animal in the church was certainly unusual, but it quickly became apparent that she meant no harm. She greeted parishioners with a gentle nudge of her nose, sat patiently by the pews during prayer, and even accompanied Father Thomas to the garden when he tended to the small patch of flowers behind the church. The children especially adored her. They would giggle as she followed them around the courtyard, her tail wagging like a metronome. Some of the elderly members of the congregation took comfort in her presence, running their hands over her soft fur as they sat in quiet contemplation.
She's a gift. It's almost as if she was sent here for a reason.
One of the older women remarked one Sunday morning as Grace rested at her feet during the service. Father Thomas nodded, though he couldn't help but think of the way Grace had acted. That first night, the frantic barking, the unwavering stare at the crucifix. It was hard to reconcile that image with the gentle, affectionate dog that now roamed the church halls, as if she had always belonged there. The congregation grew used to her presence, and for a while all seemed well. But then the barking returned. It happened one quiet afternoon as Father Thomas was setting up the altar for evening prayers. He had let Grace wander freely, trusting that she wouldn't cause trouble. He had seen her padding through the aisles earlier, sniffing curiously at the wooden pews before settling into a sunny spot near the stained-glass windows. But now there it was, the barking, sharp, urgent, almost frantic. Father Thomas's heart sank. He set down the chalice he had been polishing and hurried toward the north transept, already knowing what he would find. And there she was. Grace stood at the foot of the ancient crucifix, her body tense, her eyes locked onto the figure of Christ above. Her ears were pulled back slightly, not in fear but in intense focus. Every muscle in her body seemed tight, as if she were ready to move at any moment, yet she stayed completely still. The only sound in the quiet church was her sharp, urgent barking. Father Thomas stepped closer, his footsteps soft against the stone floor. He placed a gentle hand on her back, feeling the stiffness of her body. He spoke to her in a calm, reassuring voice, hoping to ease whatever was upsetting her. But Grace didn't react. She kept barking, her gaze never leaving the crucifix. He followed her line of sight, looking up at the wooden figure of Christ hanging on the wall. The old wood showed signs of age, small cracks running through its surface, but nothing seemed unusual. There was nothing there, at least, nothing that he could see. Still, Grace wouldn't stop staring. Father Thomas knelt beside her, running his fingers through her fur, trying to comfort her. Her barking slowed, turning into a soft whimper. Finally, she turned her head slightly toward him, as if breaking free from whatever had held her attention so strongly. With some hesitation, she allowed him to lead her away. But as they left the transept, the uneasy feeling in Father Thomas's chest remained. Grace may have calmed down for now, but something about the way she had stared at that crucifix left a lingering sense of worry deep inside him. Over the following days, Father Thomas tried everything he could to stop Grace's fixation on the crucifix. He attempted gentle correction, calling her name whenever she wandered too close to the transept. When that didn't work, he tried offering treats as a distraction. For a brief time, it seemed to work. She would pause, take the treat, and allow herself to be led away. But the moment she finished eating, her eyes would drift back to the crucifix, as if something unseen still held her attention. Desperate to keep her from causing further disturbances, he even tried restricting her access. He began shutting the heavy wooden doors to the transept, barring her from entering. But the moment she noticed the doors were closed, she would sit in front of them, staring at the wood as though she could still see through to what lay beyond. She never barked at the doors, never whined or scratched, but the way she sat there, motionless and waiting, unsettled him even more than the barking itself. It was as if she knew something he did not. Soon, the congregation began to notice Grace's peculiar behavior. At first, it was just quiet, remarks exchanged among the parishioners. Some found it strange that a dog would be so focused on a single spot in the church. Others, however, felt uneasy about it. An elderly woman mentioned one morning that animals often had a way of sensing things people could not. Another person muttered under their breath that it might be a bad omen. The whispers continued to spread. More people began to notice the way Grace would sit silently in front of the transept doors, watching, unmoving. Some became uncomfortable, while others grew frustrated when, during prayer, her sudden barking would break the silence. It wasn't long before the church council became involved. One evening, after the last of the parishioners had gone and the candles had nearly burned out, Father Thomas was approached by two council members. Mr. Alden, a man known for his strict and practical approach, had been overseeing church affairs for more than 20 years. Beside him stood Mrs. Holloway, a woman who spoke gently but carried a strong sense of responsibility. They didn't waste time getting to the point. Mr. Alden stood with his hands behind his back and said they needed to discuss the dog. Father Thomas immediately felt a knot tighten in his chest. Mrs. Holloway spoke next, her voice kind but firm. She acknowledged that Grace was a sweet dog, but she explained that people had raised concerns. Father Thomas let out a slow breath, already guessing where the conversation was headed. Mr. Alden explained that many came to the church to pray in peace, and that having an animal in especially one causing such interruptions was unusual and, to some, unacceptable. Father Thomas tried to explain that Grace wasn't trying to disrupt anything. He hesitated, struggling to put into words what even he couldn't understand. He told them how she always seemed drawn to the north transept, how he had done everything he could to stop the behavior, but nothing worked. Mrs. Holloway gave him a sympathetic look, but pointed out that, despite his efforts, the problem remained. A quiet moment passed between them. She reassured him that they weren't demanding Grace be removed, only suggesting that perhaps she would be better off in a home where she wouldn't cause so much tension. Father Thomas looked away, his jaw tightening. Grace had become part of his daily life. She had brought comfort to many in the congregation, and now she was being seen as a problem. After a pause, he finally said he would think about it. The council members exchanged looks but accepted his answer. They bid him good evening before walking away, leaving him alone in the empty church. His eyes drifted toward the transept doors. In the stillness, he could hear the faint sound of scratching against the wood. Grace was waiting. The discussion of Grace's place in the church did not fade. Every Sunday, after services had ended and the last of the parishioners had filed out, murmurs of discontent or quiet words of support would find their way to Father Thomas's ears. The church council remained divided. Some saw her as a nuisance, a disruption that disturbed the sanctity of worship. Others, particularly the older members of the congregation, saw her presence as comforting, a gentle reminder of companionship and devotion. Father Thomas found himself caught between these two sides, unable to reconcile his growing attachment to Grace with the voices urging her removal. He had taken her in without hesitation, feeling that no creature should be turned away from a place meant to offer refuge. Yet now the weight of responsibility pressed against him. The church was not just his to govern, it belonged to the people, to those who came seeking peace and solace. Doubt crept into his mind. Was he letting personal attachment cloud his judgment? Was he reading too much into her behavior, seeing purpose where there was only instinct? After all, she was just a dog. Her action-sure fixation on the crucifix, her refusal to look away could be explained away by something as simple as an old scent embedded in the wood, a trick of the light catching her attention. And yet, the way she stared, unwavering, made it difficult to dismiss entirely. The unease settled deeper within him when he began noticing other things. In the quiet hours of the evening, when the church stood empty, he would sometimes find Grace alone in the nave, her golden fur illuminated faintly by the candlelight. She no longer barked as she had that first night. Instead, she sat in utter stillness, her head tilted upward toward the crucifix, her breath slow and steady, as if waiting for something unseen to reveal itself. On more than one occasion, he would call her name softly from the doorway, but she would not turn immediately. It was as if she had not heard him. Or, worse, as if she refused to acknowledge anything but the object of her fixation. Then, at last, she would shift her head, casting him a glance before rising to her feet and trotting toward him as though nothing had happened. The silence in those moments was worse than the barking. And then there was the church itself. He had served at St. Bartholomew's for nearly a decade, had walked its corridors and knelt beneath its towering arches more times than he could count. Yet, in recent weeks, a new awareness had settled over him. He noticed the faint smell of damp wood more frequently, a scent that clung to the air after heavy rains. He began paying closer attention to the beams stretching high above the nave, the way they groaned faintly as the wind pressed against the ancient stone walls. During storms, the church seemed to breathe. The wind moaned through the tall windows, slipping through cracks in the old glass and carrying with it a strange, hollow resonance. The wooden pews creaked in the shifting air, the candle flames wavered unpredictably, and the massive crucifixo, still so unmovable, seemed to loom heavier than ever. It was in these moments that Grace's behavior unsettled him the most. One night, unable to sleep, he ventured into the church long after midnight. The storm outside had quieted, leaving behind only the dripping of water from the eaves and the occasional gust of wind rattling against the doors. He had intended only to check the candles, to ensure none had burned too low, but as he entered the nave, he saw her again. Grace was standing in the shadows of the north transept, motionless. Her eyes were fixed on the crucifix. He watched her from a distance, the flickering candlelight casting shifting patterns across the floor. She did not bark. She did not move. She simply stood there, her body rigid, her gaze locked onto the towering wooden figure above. A chill crept through him, though he told himself there was no reason for it. Still, the image lingered in his mind long after he had led her away, long after he had returned to his quarters, long after he had shut his eyes in an attempt to sleep. He found himself thinking of the old stories passed down about St. Bartholomew's, the history of the crucifix carved from olive wood, said to be taken from the Holy Land. He recalled the whispers of those who believed certain objects could hold more than just history, that the weight of time and devotion could imprint something upon them. Superstition had never been something he entertained, yet now, standing alone in the dim church, he was not so sure. The pressure to remove Grace continued to mount. Parishioners who had once spoken kindly of her now hesitated. The council's discussions grew more pointed. He was given gentle reminders that the church should be a place of quiet reverence, not disrupted by the strange behaviors of an animal. Father Thomas knew he had to make a choice. As he stood before the crucifix one evening, the church empty and quiet, he weighed the decision in his heart. Logic told him there was nothing to be concerned about. Grace was a dog, her actions nothing more than coincidence. He could send her away, find a home for her elsewhere, and the matter would be resolved. Yet, in the back of his mind, a question lingered. What if there was something he wasn't seeing? He exhaled slowly, staring up at the worn figure of Christ, the candlelight flickering against the grain of the ancient wood. Grace sat beside him in silence, waiting. Thomas lay stunned, his breath shallow, ears ringing from the deafening impact. The weight of what had just happened pressed against his chest like an unseen hand. Dust swirled in the dim candlelight, making the air thick and difficult to breathe. For a long moment, he simply lay there, trying to comprehend the chaos around him. Then, a whimper. Beside him, Grace shifted, her golden fur coated in a fine layer of dust. Her body trembled, her breaths quick and uneven, but she was alive. And so was he. Slowly, Father Thomas pushed himself up onto his elbows, ignoring the sharp protest of his muscles. His eyes widened as he took in the destruction before him. The crucifix, once a towering presence over the north transept, now lay shattered across the stone floor. The wooden figure of Christ, its once carefully carved features now marred by splintered wood, rested in pieces amid the debris. The beam that had supported it had completely collapsed, taking part of the ceiling with it. Chunks of plaster and broken fragments of wood were strewn across the ground, jagged edges catching the candlelight. Had he been standing where he was just moments ago, he would have been crushed beneath the weight of it all. The realization sent a shudder through him. Grace had saved his life. The dog whimpered again, shifting as she tried to rise on shaky legs. Instinctively, Father Thomas reached out, running a hand over her dust-covered fur.
You knew,
he murmured, voice barely above a whisper. Grace turned her tired eyes toward him, her body still trembling, though her barking had finally stopped. There was nothing left to warn him about. The danger had come and gone. A sharp gust of wind rushed through the open gaps in the ceiling, carrying with it the scent of rain and the lingering smell of damp wood. Father Thomas swallowed hard, still trying to steady himself. He had nearly dismissed her, nearly cast her out, convinced that her strange behavior had been nothing more than an animal's confusion. How many times had he ignored her desperate warnings? How often had he let doubt cloud his judgment? Another shudder ran through him, though this time it wasn't from the cold. With great effort, he pushed himself to his feet, still unsteady, his legs weak beneath him. He took a slow step forward, surveying the damage. The crucifix was beyond repair. The ceiling would take months to restore. But he was alive. And Grace had been right all along. A distant sound reached his ears' footsteps, hurried and growing closer. Someone must have heard the collapse. Grace let out a soft, tired sigh and pressed herself against his leg. Father Thomas placed a hand on her head, his fingers threading through her fur. For the first time in weeks, he no longer questioned whether she belonged in the church. The night stretched long after the collapse, the once sacred silence of the church broken by the commotion of emergency responders. Flashlights cut through the dust, illuminating the wreckage where the great crucifix had once stood. Voices overlapped in urgent discussion, assessing the damage, ensuring no one had been caught beneath the debris. The air was thick with the acrid scent of shattered wood and plaster, mingling with the ever-present dampness of the old church wall. Father Thomas stood at the edge of it all, his cassock streaked with dust, his hands unsteady at his sides. He could hear the muffled voices of parishioners who had returned after hearing the terrible crash. Some hovered near the entrance, whispering prayers of thanks that no lives had been lost. Others cast uneasy glances at the ruins of the north transept, shaken by the realization of how close they had all come to disaster. Grace sat at his feet, exhausted, her golden fur coated in fine debris. Her ears twitched at every sharp sound, but she no longer barked. There was nothing left to warn them about. The structural engineers arrived before dawn, their presence brisk and methodical. They moved with quiet efficiency, examining the fallen crucifix, the fractured beams, the gaping hole in the ceiling that now let in the faintest hints of early morning light. Clipboards in hand, they muttered amongst themselves, tracing fingers over the rotted wood and nodding grimly at one another. Their conclusion was undeniable. The supporting beam had been failing for decades, weakened by unseen water damage. Years of exposure, gradual decay, and the unrelenting burden of time had worn it down until only a fragile core remained. The storm had been the final catalyst. The vibrations from the wind, the shifting air pressure, and the sharp shocks of thunder had pushed the structure beyond its limits. The collapse had been inevitable. A truth that should have been evident, if only someone had noticed the signs. The revelation spread through the congregation like wildfire. Conversations that had once been laced with skepticism took on hushed, reverent tones. The dog they had dismissed as a nuisance had known. Her frantic barking, her ceaseless fixation on the crucifix, none of it had been meaningless. She had sensed the danger long before any human had, warning them in the only way she could. Regret settled heavily upon those who had been the most vocal about removing her from the church. What if they had succeeded? What if she had been taken away before she could alert them to the imminent collapse? The thought was unbearable. The church council, once divided on the matter of Grace's presence, now stood unified in their gratitude. The same parishioners, who had whispered about her being a disruption, now whispered about something else entirely. A guardian. Some saw it as a miracle, a sign that she had been sent by divine will. Others, more cautious in their faith, acknowledged at the very least that she had been an instrument of providence. Father Thomas listened to it all, absorbing every murmured speculation, every shift in perception. But what struck him the most was his own failure to see. He had nearly cast her out. He had dismissed the warnings because they came in a form he did not understand. The weight of that realization settled deep within him. How often had he preached about faith, about the ways in which the divine moved in mysterious ways? And yet, when confronted with a sign outside the bounds of human comprehension, he had hesitated, rationalized, ignored. Grace had never wavered. She had stood her ground when no one else had listened, driven by an instinct more profound than logic. And in the end, she had saved them all. The dawnlight grew stronger, filtering through the damaged ceiling, casting a soft glow upon the wreckage. It illuminated the fallen crucifix, its broken form still resting where it had landed. It caught the dust that floated in the air, turning it to gold. And it settled upon Grace, who sat quietly beside him, her breathing steady now, her watchful eyes unblinking. Father Thomas reached down, his fingers brushing against her fur. He would not make the same mistake again. The weeks following the collapse were filled with the steady hum of restoration. The north transept, once marked by destruction and fear, now became a place of renewal. The congregation, moved by what had transpired, gathered in unity to repair what had been lost. Skilled workers were brought in to assess the damage, while volunteers from the parish offered their time, sweeping away the last remnants of debris, polishing pews, and ensuring that the heart of St. Bartholomew's remained strong despite its wounds. The ancient crucifix, though shattered, was not beyond repair. Expert craftsmen were called upon to restore it, carefully piecing together the fragments of the figure, reinforcing the wooden frame that had borne its weight for centuries. Though they worked with delicate precision, the damage could not be erased entirely. A faint, nearly imperceptible line remained where the wood had split, a subtle mark of its falloon that would forever serve as a quiet testament to what had happened that fateful night. For Father Thomas, the days blurred into one another, filled with meetings, decisions, and the careful guidance of his parishioners, who now looked to him not just for leadership, but for meaning. The story of Grace had taken on a life of its own, whispered in quiet conversations among the pews, spoken with reverence in the candlelit hush of evening prayers. Where once some had questioned her presence, there was now only certainty. She had been meant to be here. When the repairs neared completion, the congregation decided that something more permanent was needed, not just a restoration, but a tribute to the one who had saved them. A small plaque was commissioned and placed in the transept near the newly restored crucifix. The words were simple yet profound. Protected by faith and guided by grace. It was a gesture that meant more to Father Thomas than he could express. When Sunday arrived and the church doors opened for the first time since the collapse, there was an unmistakable shift in the air. The pews were full, the voices in prayer steady and strong. Candlelight flickered against the high stone walls, casting a glow upon the crucifix that once again stood over them. But there was something else now, something unspoken, woven into the very essence of the place. Father Thomas stood before his congregation, the weight of recent events still pressing upon him. He spoke not only of the night the ceiling had given way, but of what had truly happened, how a warning had gone unheard, because it had come in a form that did not fit human understanding. How often, he asked them to consider, did they turn away from signs simply because they did not recognize them? How many times had grace arrived in an unexpected shape only to be dismissed? There was a quiet stillness in the church as they listened. He saw it in their faces, the shift, the realization. This was no longer just a story of a building saved. It was something deeper, something that touched the core of their beliefs. After the sermon, as the congregation lingered, many stopping to kneel before the restored crucifix or to glance at the plaque in quiet reflection, Grace moved through the crowd, no longer a source of controversy, no longer a stray without a home. She belonged to the church now in a way no one could question. She remained by Father Thomas's side, her presence a quiet reassurance, a reminder that faith often required listening in ways they did not expect. She no longer barked in the north transept, no longer fixated on the crucifix with unease. Whatever had driven her relentless warnings before had passed, and now she simply watched over the church with calm vigilance. The seasons turned, and life at St. Bartholomew's continued, shaped by the memory of what had happened, but no longer burdened by it. The church stood strong, its walls bearing both the weight of history and the mark of renewal. Services were held, prayers were whispered, and candles burned in devotion beneath the solemn gaze of the crucifix that had been brought back from the brink of ruin. One evening, as dusk settled over the quiet halls, Father Thomas knelt before the altar, the glow of the remaining candles casting long shadows against the stone floor. The scent of incense lingered in the air, mingling with the cool hush of the coming night. The weight of all that had happened still rested within him, not as a burden, but as a lesson known he would carry for the rest of his days. Beside him, Grace lay with her head resting on her paws, her eyes half closed but ever watchful. There was a peace about her now, a quiet certainty that mirrored the stillness of the church itself. Father Thomas remained there for a long time, allowing the silence to wrap around him, feeling the unshakable presence of something greater than himself. The night deepened, and the candles flickered low, but he did not move. The guardian of St. Bartholomew's was exactly where she was meant to be,